I came home carrying flowers for my wife after spending 4 secret days with my mistress. I thought the hardest part of the night would be telling another lie. I had no idea my wife had already spent those 4 days destroying everything I had spent 11 years building, and that by midnight I would not have a house, a marriage, or an explanation good enough to save me. My name is Nathaniel Cole, and this is the night I learned that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the most dangerous one. For 11 years, I believed I was the smartest man in every room I walked into. I ran a boutique investment firm on the outskirts of Denver. I drove a car that turned heads on the highway, and I had a wife named Josephine, who I was certain would always be there, no matter what I did. Because that is the story men like me tell ourselves right up until the moment reality kicks the door down. I had just returned from a lakeside cabin in Aspen with a woman named Brooke, a marketing consultant I had been seeing for 8 months. I told Josephine it was a solo retreat to clear my head. On the drive home, I stopped for white peonies, her favorite, because flowers had always been the fastest way to smooth over a lie. I even believed my own excuse a little by the time I reached the driveway. The house was too quiet, and that quiet had a texture to it, heavy and wrong, the kind of silence that tells you something has already happened before you even see it. Our housekeeper, Rosalind, was folding towels in the hallway with the calm of someone who had already made peace with what she was about to say. She looked at me like a stranger who had wandered into the wrong house. She told me Josephine had left 3 days earlier and taken our daughter Willow with her. I asked if she had gone to her parents. Rosalind shook her head slowly. No, sir, she found her own place. And then she said the sentence that made my stomach drop through the floor. She asked me to give you this when you got back. She held out a plain white envelope. And for a moment I actually smiled, because I assumed it was a goodbye letter. The kind you could talk your way around with enough charm and enough tears. I was wrong. Inside was a single printed page, a timeline laid out like courtroom evidence. The Aspen cabin booking under my card, a jewelry receipt from a shop 2 blocks from that cabin, hotel charges from 3 other trips I thought I had covered well enough. At the bottom, in her handwriting, 1 line. I stopped believing your business trips the day you forgot our anniversary was the same week as one of them. I stood in the doorway holding flowers for a wife who was no longer there to receive them, and somewhere underneath the panic, a small, cold voice in my head asked a question I could not shake. If she already had this much proof, what else did she have that I had not seen yet? I asked Rosalind one more question before she left that night, the one I was almost afraid to ask. I asked her how Josephine had seemed when she packed. Not angry, Rosalind said, choosing her words carefully. Focused. She said your wife did not cry once in front of her, not even when she was folding the baby clothes into boxes. She said Josephine kept a small notebook with her the entire time, writing things down, checking items off a list like she was closing out a project at work rather than ending a marriage. That detail sat wrong with me for hours. Angry women scream. Heartbroken women cry. Women with a plan write things down in notebooks. And I did not yet understand what kind of plan I was dealing with. What I did not know that night was that Josephine had not always been the soft-spoken woman who ran our household and picked Willow up from preschool. Before we married, she spent 6 years as a forensic accountant, the kind hired specifically to trace money that people had worked very hard to hide. She was good enough at it that 2 different firms had tried to poach her in the same year we got engaged. She gave that career up when Willow was born because I told her one income was enough, that our family needed her at home more than it needed her salary, and she agreed so easily that I never once questioned whether she had actually wanted to. I had spent years quietly congratulating myself on how easy she was to manage. I never once stopped to consider what a woman like that becomes the day she finally decides to stop being managed, or how much of her old self she had simply been storing away, waiting for a reason to use it again. I called her 11 times that first hour and got nothing but silence. I called her sister, no answer. Her college roommate, no answer. Even her old boss, a man she had not spoken to in 6 years, picked up just long enough to say he had nothing to say to me, and hung up. Every single person in her life had already closed ranks around her, which meant one horrifying thing. She had not left in a panic. She had left with a plan, and everyone in it had known for days before I did. Around midnight, my laptop lit up with a notification from the bank, and when I opened it, the floor seemed to tilt under me. Every joint account, every investment line, every card tied to our household had been frozen pending legal review at the request of opposing counsel. I was not simply abandoned. I was being dismantled piece by piece by someone who had clearly started planning this weeks before I ever checked into that cabin. I sat there staring at the screen thinking, she knew before Aspen. She let me go anyway. Why? I called my attorney, Marcus Feld, and explained what was happening in a voice I barely recognized as mine. He went quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that costs you money before he even speaks. He told me a freeze like this does not happen without serious documentation, the kind that convinces a judge there is real risk of hidden assets. Then he asked me the question I had been dreading. Is there anyone else you have been financially supporting outside your marriage? My silence answered for me. He sighed the way a man sighs when he already knows the case is lost before it starts, and told me Josephine's filing referenced a pattern of diverted funds, built with the precision of someone who used to do this exact kind of work for a living. I told myself it could not get worse than that. It got worse within the hour. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I did not recognize, and the photograph attached made the room tilt sideways all over again. It was Willow in a hospital bed, small tubes taped to her tiny arm, a monitor blinking beside her. The message underneath read, "While you were at the lake, your daughter had a severe asthma attack and I spent 2 nights alone in the ER because you were unreachable." I remembered faintly a voicemail from Rosalind days earlier about Willow coughing more than usual. I remembered dismissing it because I did not want anything interrupting those 4 days. That memory landed on me heavier than the frozen accounts ever could, and for the first time that night I understood that this was not just about a marriage. This was about what kind of father I had already become long before Josephine ever found out. I drove to St. Agnes Medical Center running 2 red lights, my hands shaking so badly on the wheel that I almost missed the turn into the parking garage. I ran through the sliding doors still holding the peonies, because somewhere in my panic I had forgotten to leave them in the car, and a nurse actually stopped and asked if the flowers were for someone in the building. I did not answer her. I kept walking until I reached the pediatric wing, and I saw Josephine through the glass before she saw me. She was speaking calmly with a doctor, a small notebook in her hand, her posture straighter than I had ever noticed in 11 years of marriage, because I had only ever let myself see her as soft. Willow was asleep behind her in a bed that looked far too big for a 5-year-old, a thin tube taped beneath her nose. And the sight of my daughter that small, and that still nearly put me on the floor. When Josephine finally turned and our eyes met through the glass, there was no anger on her face at all, only a stillness that frightened me more than screaming ever could have. I raised my hand against the glass without thinking, the way you would try to get the attention of someone drowning. She looked at me the way you look at a stranger standing outside a window, and then she turned back to the doctor, as if I had already stopped existing in the room. I stood there holding dying flowers in a hospital hallway, watching my wife take care of our daughter without me, and understood for the first time that I was not being punished. I was simply being removed. Over the following days, the shape of what she had built kept getting bigger, and every time I thought I understood the damage, another piece landed. She had spent months quietly gathering records with a lawyer, working nights after Willow was asleep, cross-referencing statements the same way she used to for strangers when it was still her job. She had gone to my business partner Desmond. A man I had trusted since college sat across from him with a folder of printed statements, and shown him evidence that some of the money funneled to Brooke had come from client funds I was never authorized to touch. Desmond called me 2 days later, and I actually thought for a moment he was calling to help me. He was not. Facing his own liability if he stayed silent, he chose to protect the firm and the 40 families whose money we managed rather than protect me. He did not call to accuse me. He called in a flat, professional voice to tell me he was cooperating fully with the investigation, and hearing that voice, the same voice that had toasted at my wedding, was somehow worse than if he had screamed at me across a table. Then came Brooke. I drove to her apartment that same week, still half convinced that whatever we had was real enough to survive this. I found her packing, designer bags open across the floor, and when she saw me, she did not soften at all. She told me the lease on that apartment had always been in my name, and that the moment my accounts froze, her own bank had flagged the transfers I had sent her as suspicious activity tied to an active investigation. She was not just losing me. She was being pulled into the fraud case as a person of interest, and she blamed me for every second of it. Watching her scramble to disappear before investigators could reach her, I finally understood that everything I thought was passion had only ever been convenience. And the moment the money stopped, so did she. The settlement Josephine's attorney sent over was brutal in its simplicity. I would surrender the majority of our joint assets. My stake in the firm would be restructured to protect the clients I had put at risk. I would pay full support for Willow without contest, and in exchange, Josephine would not pursue additional civil claims that could have buried me in litigation for years. There was no cruelty in the wording, only precision, and somehow that made it worse than if she had screamed at me across a table. I signed it 3 weeks later with unsteady hands, and when I stepped outside afterward, the sunlight felt like it belonged to someone else's life entirely. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, sold the car, and took a junior position at a smaller firm where nobody knew who I used to be. The hardest part was not losing the house or the title. It was the silence in the evenings, the empty second chair at every table, the realization that I had traded 11 years of a real family for 4 days that meant nothing to anyone once the money disappeared. It took almost 2 years before I fully understood what Josephine had actually been protecting that night, and it was never about revenge at all. It was about Willow, and about making sure her daughter never grew up believing that love meant staying quiet while someone dismantled you. Josephine rebuilt her own career, eventually starting a small consulting practice that helped other families untangle their finances after betrayal. And she never once used our story publicly or cruelly. I paid support every month, kept my distance exactly as she asked, and slowly relearned how to be a person who did not measure his worth by what he could get away with. On Willow's 10th birthday, Josephine allowed a supervised visit for the first time in 2 years. My daughter walked in carrying a folded piece of paper, and when she handed it to me, I saw a crayon drawing of 2 houses connected by a single winding path, with a small stick figure walking between them. Underneath, in careful handwriting, she had written, "I still have 2 people who love me." I sat in that room and cried in front of my daughter for the first time in my life. Not because I had lost everything, but because somehow, after all of it, she had decided I was still worth the walk. I am still earning that walk. 1 quiet month at a time, and I no longer take it for granted that I get to. If this story moved you, hit subscribe to the Revenge Tales, because next week we bring you another true story of betrayal, strength, and the quiet reckoning that follows it.